The Office of Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg has invited Donald Trump to testify in an investigation into a hush money scheme involving adult film star Stormy Daniels. That's believed to be a precursor to an indictment. Potential defendants in New York are required by law to be notified and invited to appear before a grand jury weighing any charges. If charged, Trump would become the first former president to be indicted. But would it necessarily slow his current presidential quest? I say not a chance, at least not based on this case alone. Any charges here would stem from the $130,000 in payments made to Daniels during the 2016 campaign. Apparently, she'd been ready to share her story of an affair with Trump with the National Enquirer. But the tabloid's publisher, David Pecker, was a Trump friend who instead helped broker a deal with Trump's then lawyer, Michael Cohen, in which she was paid for her silence. I've long thought that it was the weakest of the known Trump investigations, which generally fall into four buckets. First, the events of January 6. Second, the mishandling of government documents, including at Mar-a-Lago. Third, the Fulton County DA investigation of election interference, including the so-called perfect phone call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. And fourth, the Stormy Daniels hush money. Merrick Garland appointed Jack Smith as special counsel to look at both January 6 and Mar-a-Lago. Meanwhile, the Georgia Special Grand Jury investigating election interference has concluded its work and recommended indictments for more than a dozen people. It's enough to keep awake any presidential candidate, but when it comes to Donald Trump, no matter what he steps in, somehow he seems to emerge smelling like a rose. While he was being investigated for his handling of classified documents, a process that included the execution of a search warrant at his home, classified information was found in the homes of Mike Pence and Joe Biden. Not an apples-to-apples comparison, but enough to muddy the court of public opinion and make it seem like he's not alone. In the Fulton County case, the grand jury foreperson gave media interviews casting a shadow on the work of that investigation, and at a minimum, giving Trump's lawyers a basis to question the process. I've long thought that the Mar-a-Lago case was the most perilous to Trump. The facts seem pretty straightforward and damning. The Manhattan DA's prosecution based on Stormy Daniels? Not so much. The money was paid in 2016, 7 years ago, and any prosecution would have to rely on a statute of limitations having been told while he was in office. That's unprecedented and untested. It also would rely on what the New York Times calls a novel legal theory, the uniting of two cases falsifying business records and a violation of state election law. Only by connecting the first to the second would it be a felony. And if that strategy should fail, the Manhattan DA would be left with a 7-year-old misdemeanor case based on sex brought against a former president and current presidential candidate who leads his own party's polls. I thought we learned in the 90s that sex scandals alone don't tank a president's popularity. Also, I find it curious that Alvin Bragg, having decided not to prosecute Trump in other matters, would choose this hill to die on. Remember, when Bragg announced that he would not move forward in a case about Trump's business practices, two lead prosecutors quit the department. One, Mark Pomerantz, leaked his resignation letter to the press, and it said that Bragg's predecessor, Cy Vance, quote, concluded that the facts warranted prosecution, and he directed the team to present evidence to a grand jury and seek an indictment of Mr. Trump and other defendants as soon as reasonably possible. Pomerantz has just published a book about this. It's called The People versus Donald Trump, an inside account. When Bragg won a criminal case for fraud against the Trump Corporation and Trump Payroll Corporation, he did not pursue Trump personally. Instead, he seems to be honing in on the much smaller malfeasance. It should also be noted that even after Trump left office and shed his immunity, the federal investigation of the Daniels case, that which had sent former attorney Michael Cohen to prison, in which Trump had been referred to as individual number one, was not prosecuted by the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, who instead took a pass. Now, of course, Trump seeks to exploit all of this by crying witch hunt. At Truth Social, he said, "I did absolutely nothing wrong. I never had an affair with Stormy Daniels, nor would I have wanted to have an affair with Stormy Daniels. This is a political witch hunt trying to take down a leading candidate by far in the Republican Party, while at the same time also leading all Democrats in the polls, et cetera, et cetera." You have to wonder what Merrick Garland, Jack Smith, and Fani Willis were all thinking when news broke that it's Alvin Bragg who who might get the first bite at the apple. If each of the others is seriously contemplating indicting Trump, you'd have to think they'd rather the first claim be the strongest. The Stormy Daniels case, it sets the wrong tone. It's the one that most plays into Trump's claim of a politically motivated prosecution, whether that's true or not. It could define all those that follow, all now in the context of a presidential race well underway. Ron DeSantis arrived in Iowa on Friday. Donald Trump is headed there on Monday. It's time for all of these prosecutors to play their hand or fold. Joining me now is Renato Mariotti. He's a former federal prosecutor himself, legal affairs columnist for Politico, co-host of the podcast It's Complicated, and a partner at a firm called Bryan Cave. Renato, welcome back. What's your take on this week's developments?
Well, I agree with you, Michael. This is the weakest of the cases against Trump. That said, I think it causes problems for Trump. In other words, you laid out this array of potential charges. I will tell you, it is always difficult to try to fight a multi-front war, and anything that Trump says or does in relation to this case, it just makes it more complicated if he ultimately faces charges in Fulton County and elsewhere. Certainly, I think he will in Fulton County.
If, in fact, he's indicted on multiple fronts, does it matter which goes first? You heard my take on this. I think to lead with the weak might taint those that follow. Perhaps you disagree.
It does matter, but it's more complicated than that. In other words, there's often a very careful dance that's done by defense attorneys to try to slow down one case and speed up another in order to get the trial in one case before the other. The defense wants the trial in the weaker case to go earlier, but that's doesn't always work out that way. It'll be interesting to see how that all develops. I agree with you that, certainly Jack Smith would prefer that these other prosecutors aren't out there. Of course, I'm sure, some of the prosecutors, let's say in the R. Kelly cases didn't want all of those other prosecutors charging as well. It's part of how the system works.
Renato, why do you think that Alvin Bragg, having passed on, I think, what you and I regard as better cases, would have chosen this one to hone in on?
It's interesting, Michael. I originally thought that Alvin Bragg made a very brave choice by deciding to take a pass on what appeared to be stronger charges against Trump. These were the charges that ultimately were taken up by Letitia James in a civil case. But later on, he, I think, was misleading the public regarding whether or not that investigation was still ongoing. It just made me wonder whether or not public pressure, because he's obviously an elected official, had something to do with that. I don't know whether that had something to do with him deciding to go forward with this prosecution, but I think it's a legitimate question.
I said that Ron DeSantis was in Iowa yesterday. I perhaps also should have said Nikki Haley was in Iowa yesterday. Donald Trump will be there on Monday. Of what concern or consideration is the fact that this race is beginning to both Merrick Garland and to Jack Smith? How does that impact their decision-making and timetable?
Well, it's a great question. I do think that the fact that that race is ongoing is what caused Merrick Garland to appoint Jack Smith in the first place. And I think what Mr. Smith has to weigh is whether or not this is going to be seen as an attempt by the Justice Department to impact the presidential race. And really, he's going to have to consider the long-term impact on the department, because ultimately the Department of Justice wants the public to have confidence that it's outside of politics. I agree with you that the Mar-a-Lago case was by far the strongest. It's clear that Jack Smith, though, is working up the January 6th case in an aggressive fashion as well. I think if he indicts soon, it won't be seen as too close to the election, but obviously he's on a bit of a timetable.